According to a massive Pew Research study conducted between 2019 and 2020, 98% of modern Indians identify with a caste.
Yeah, which is just a staggering number.
It really is. And, before you assume this is strictly a Hindu concept, this data actually spans across religions. We're talking about Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs all identifying with a caste.
Right. And that statistic, it completely shatters the conventional Western assumption that we are dealing with, like a purely Hindu religious doctrine.
Right, exactly.
Because when a social classification system crosses entirely different theological boundaries, from polytheistic traditions to strict monotheism, you're looking at something much deeper than religious scripture. You're looking at a foundational social architecture.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to cut through centuries of dense history and dismantle the myth that the Indian caste system is simply an ancient, unchanging rule passed down by the gods.
Yeah, we're going to trace its DNA literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And discover exactly how it evolved into a distinctly modern phenomenon that dictates life for over 1 billion people. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to figure out how we got here, we have to go back to the blueprint.
We do.
And surprisingly, the very word we use to describe this system isn't even Indian.
No, it's not. The term caste is actually derived from the Portuguese word casta.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which translates roughly to race, lineage, or breed. So when Portuguese colonists arrived in India in the late 15th and 16th centuries, they observed this highly complex social structure and just applied their own singular word to it.
Which kind of oversimplifies things, right?
Massively. In doing so, they essentially lumped together two distinct native concepts that we really have to separate if we want to understand how this machinery actually works.
Right.
And those two concepts are Varna and Jati.
Let's break those down. Starting with Varna, this is the ancient Vedic framework, translating broadly to type, order, or class.
Right.
There are 4 main Varnas laid out in ancient texts. You've got the Brahmins, who are the priests and scholars, the Kshatriyas, the rulers and warriors, the Vaishyas, the merchants and farmers, and the Shudras, the laborers.
Yeah, that's the core 4.
And then, implicitly placed outside of this 4-tier framework entirely, you have the Dalits, historically referred to as untouchables, and the Adifes, the indigenous tribal communities.
Exactly. And Varna is best understood as a broad theoretical framework. It's a macro-level categorization.
Right.
But the second concept, Jati, is the actual on-the-ground reality. Jati translates to birth.
Got it.
So while there are only 4 Varnas, there are literally thousands upon thousands of Jatis.
Wow, thousands.
Thousands. And these are highly complex, localized, endogamous groups, meaning you marry strictly within your specific Jati.
I see.
And they were often tied to specific regions and historically to specific occupations.
I think about it like this. Varna is kind of like your broad astrological sign.
That's a good way to look at it.
Right. It's a vast theoretical category that supposedly says something about your overarching nature. But Jati is your actual family, your specific hometown, your immediate community.
Yes.
It's the tangible reality that dictates who you eat with, who you associate with, and who you marry.
Spot on.
But wait, if ancient texts like the Rig Veda or the Manusmriti laid out these rigid rules for Varna, did people actually follow them strictly back then? It's hard to imagine an entire subcontinent uniformly agreeing to an astrological-style social grid.
Well, that is where critical thinking becomes essential, because we have to separate religious blueprints from sociological facts.
Right.
Historians and Sanskrit scholars point out that the Rig Veda, which is one of the oldest known Vedic texts, barely mentions Varna at all.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The specific verse outlining the 4-tier system, known as the Purusha Sukta, is widely considered by scholars to be a much later insertion into the text.
So the oldest text didn't even have this foundational social pyramid baked in from the start.
They did not. And even when we look at later texts, like the Manusmriti, which provides a highly elaborate schematic commentary on Varna and social duties.
Right, the one with all the rules.
Exactly. But we have to remember who wrote it. These texts provided idealized models, not empirical descriptions of daily life.
Oh, I see.
They were ideological aspirations written by the elite priestly class, the Brahmins, to legitimize and elevate their own status in the social hierarchy.
So it was essentially a social wish list.
Perfectly said. It was a wish list, not a rigid set of laws that a decentralized ancient agrarian society was blindly following.
So if Varna was more of an elite propaganda campaign and Jati, these localized and marrying groups, was the actual functional unit of society, how do we know when people actually stop marrying outside their group?
Right, the marriage aspect.
Because that seems to be the crucial mechanism of the whole system. When does the wish list become reality?
To answer that, we actually have to step away from historical texts and look at human genomes.
Oh, genetic science. Yeah. A massive 2016 DNA study analyzed the genetic makeup of unrelated Indians across various regions and social groups.
Okay.
And the geneticists were looking for markers of admixture, which is just scientific shorthand for different populations intermarrying and mixing their DNA.
And what they found was a massive paradigm shift.
It was.
The DNA evidence showed that for centuries there was significant genetic mixing across the subcontinent. But then, strict endogamy, the practice of exclusively marrying within one specific group, suddenly kicks into high gear during the Gupta Empire.
Which ruled from roughly 390 to 550 CE.
Right. What happened then?
What's fascinating here is the political environment. The Gupta period is often romanticized as a golden age of Indian art and science, but it was also a period of intense agrarian expansion and state building.
So they were growing and organizing?
Exactly. The political economy of the Gupta Empire required massive administration. The state began issuing large land grants to Brahmins to settle uncultivated areas.
And when these elites moved into new territories, they encountered indigenous forest-dwelling tribes.
Right, the Yiddivasis.
Right. To integrate these diverse groups into a new, highly structured agricultural economy, the state and the religious elite worked together to codify social orthodoxy.
Wow. So they enforced the system from the top down.
Yes. They physically mapped the hierarchy onto new territories, assigning marginalized groups to the lowest rungs of agricultural labor, and rigorously enforcing marriage boundaries to protect property and power.
But history is rarely a straight line, because as we move out of the ancient world and forward into the medieval era, the system was surprisingly fluid.
It was incredibly fluid.
We have this ingrained idea of the caste system as a rigid, inescapable ladder where nobody ever moves, but the historical records from the medieval period tell a completely different story.
What's fascinating here is the sheer contradiction between the biological data and the occupational records.
Right.
While the DNA clearly shows that upper caste marriage lines were hardening and endogamy was becoming the norm, the occupational and social reality on the ground during the medieval period was characterized by massive mobility.
A perfect example of this is the Kakatiya dynasty, which ruled in the Deccan region between the 11th and 14th centuries. During this time, Shudras, who theoretically belonged to the lowest of the four Varnas, the laboring class, were actually part of the nobility.
Yeah, they were elites.
Furthermore, historical records from this era show that fathers and sons often had completely different professions. You might have a father who was a farmer, and his son could become a prominent military commander.
Which completely shatters the notion that occupation was purely inherited by caste.
Exactly.
In medieval India, social status was very often earned. We are talking about a pre-colonial landscape where political power was highly fragmented.
It was a bunch of different kingdoms, right?
Yeah, right. The subcontinent was essentially a network of dynamic, shifting frontiers. If you could clear a forest, build an irrigation tank, or amass a war band, you could claim higher social status.
Wow.
Yeah, anyone with enough prowess and military might could become a warrior. The society was dominated by open status groups and fluid religious sects, not inescapable rigid categories.
It really changes how you view history. People weren't just robotically following ancient scripts. They were adapting to economic realities.
Exactly.
If a regional king needed an army to defend against an invasion, he didn't check a soldier's Varna before handing him a weapon. You gave a sword to the guy who could fight.
Pragmatism won out.
Yeah, you formed alliances based on immediate political necessity.
It was a deeply negotiated reality. Caste identities were relatively loose, and communities frequently grouped themselves together to maximize assets or protect themselves in times of statelessness.
Okay.
The boundaries of jati existed, for sure, but they were permeable and highly pragmatic.
Which brings up the million-dollar question. If the medieval period was this dynamic, fluid ecosystem where a Shudra could become a nobleman and military service was an open market, how on earth did we end up with the perfectly categorized, rigid hierarchy we picture today?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at the administrative anxieties of the British Raj.
Ah, the British. The British arrive, and by the 19th century, they are attempting to govern a population of roughly 200 million people, spread across hundreds of thousands of diverse villages.
Yeah.
For colonial administrators, this was an absolute logistical nightmare. They needed to categorize the population in order to govern them, tax them, and control them.
And, the British bureaucrats were coming from a Victorian society that was itself obsessed with rigid class structures.
Oh, definitely.
And they were heavily influenced by the emerging, deeply flawed pseudoscience of race.
Right.
They looked at the messy, fluid reality of India and tried to force it into a comprehensible scientific template.
This all culminates in the census. Starting with the 1881 census, colonial administrators began classifying Indians by their jatis. But they didn't just list the names of the groups.
No, they went way further.
They actively ranked, standardized, and cross-referenced these jatis. They employed the language of zoology and botanical classifications.
It's wild to read about.
British officials literally walked around with calipers, measuring nasal indexes and skull widths, trying to scientifically categorize the population by supposed racial purity and occupational origins.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the British didn't just document the caste system, they fundamentally weaponized it.
Yeah, they made it real in a new way.
Exactly. Once a massive colonial bureaucracy places you in a specific box on a census form, they can start assigning rights, distributing resources, and deploying punishments based entirely on that box.
The mechanisms they used to enforce this were devastating. The British started awarding coveted government jobs and administrative appointments exclusively to what they officially designated as forward or upper castes. But the legislation went much further than employment. Look at the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871.
That is perhaps one of the most tragic pieces of colonial legislation. Under the Criminal Tribes Act, the government legally declared that entire communities of millions of people were addicted to the systematic commission of non-bailable offenses.
Wow.
They were legally branded as criminals by birth. It had absolutely nothing to do with individual actions.
The mechanism of enforcement was brutal. The colonial authorities took communities that were perhaps historically nomadic or groups that had rebelled against taxation and forced them into barbed wire settlements.
Yeah.
People born into these specific census categories were subjected to daily roll calls, their movements were restricted by a pass system, and they were arbitrarily arrested simply for existing outside their designated zones.
So it was horrific. And we also have to look at the economic lock-in.
Right, the land laws.
Yeah, the colonial government passed laws like the Land Alienation Act of 1900, which strictly dictated which specific castes could legally own land. This essentially prevented the transfer of property to any group not officially stamped as an agricultural caste by the British bureaucracy. They legally blocked the economic mobility of millions of people, tying their financial destiny to an arbitrary census category.
It's a bit like taking a massive, chaotic, incredibly successful neighborhood potluck where everyone is constantly trading recipes and switching seats.
Right.
And suddenly forcing the entire event into a strict, inescapable corporate org chart.
That's a great analogy.
Once you publish the org chart, that becomes the new reality. Scholars like Nicholas Dirks argue persuasively that colonialism fundamentally made caste what it is today.
Absolutely.
By tying employment, property rights, and criminal justice to rigid census categories, the British took a fluid, localized social system and turned it into an iron grid spanning the entire subcontinent.
And that iron grid proved incredibly difficult to dismantle. When India finally gained independence in 1947, the founders of the new republic inherited this deeply entrenched, legally codified hierarchy. The newly drafted constitution explicitly banned discrimination on the basis of caste under Article 15, and Article 17 officially abolished the practice of untouchability.
But you can't just erase a century of violent categorization with a pen stroke.
No, you can't.
The new democracy faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you economically and socially uplift millions of people who had been legally marginalized from education and land ownership for generations?
This led to the implementation of one of the most extensive affirmative action programs in human history, widely known as the reservation system.
The quotas.
Yes. The government established strict quotas in public sector jobs, government institutions, and higher education.
Right.
They created official constitutional designations. You had scheduled castes, which includes Dalits, scheduled tribes encompassing the Adivasis, and eventually, following the massive sociological surveys of the Mandel Commission in the late 1970s and 80s, quotas were expanded to include other backward classes, or OBCs.
The historical intent was to correct systemic injustice and provide a level playing field. And, the data shows this system has driven significant change.
It definitely has.
For instance, the presence of people from the lowest castes in the highest-paying, senior-most government jobs increased roughly tenfold between 1959 and 1995. Millions of people accessed higher education who otherwise would have been structurally locked out.
However, the reservation system also creates an incredibly complex modern paradox.
It really does.
While it elevates historically disadvantaged groups, it also fuels intense societal tension and massive protests. Because these quotas are tied to immense economic and educational opportunities in a country with fierce competition for resources, the system inadvertently incentivizes people to hold on to and actively claim backward caste status.
You end up with communities fiercely protesting, sometimes shutting down entire states, demanding to be officially downgraded in the government's classification system so they can access the reservation quotas. It creates a highly charged political environment where vote bank politics dominates. Political parties frequently tailor their entire platforms to court specific caste demographics, meaning the social stratification remains deeply embedded in the daily political fabric of the nation.
It's a feedback loop.
Yeah. But, okay, here's where it gets really interesting. You might assume this incredibly complex social dynamics is geographically contained within India's borders.
Right.
But globalization and the massive migration of skilled labor have exported the nuances of this system across the world.
Yeah, the implicit biases, the social networks, and the hierarchies of caste have migrated directly into the hyper-modern environments of the global diaspora.
Look at the watershed lawsuit filed in California in 2020. The state's civil rights department sued Cisco Systems, a massive Silicon Valley tech company, and two of its engineering managers. The lawsuit alleged that an Indian engineer was facing intense discrimination, harassment, and professional retaliation from his managers. The reason? The managers were from a dominant higher caste, and the engineer was a Dalit.
And that case forced American institutions to grapple with a huge blind spot in their own frameworks.
Right.
Western civil rights laws are traditionally designed to recognize discrimination based on race, gender, or religion. They were not equipped to understand how a manager might use subtle social cues, like asking about dietary habits, investigating which specific village someone's grandparents are from, or observing social networks to exclude a Dalit colleague from a promotion within a seemingly meritocratic tech company.
And back in India, the modern reality is a story of two opposing forces. Deep divides and horrific violence definitely remain.
Sadly, yes.
Crimes against scheduled castes and tribes are still reported in alarmingly high numbers. And culturally, 3 out of 5 Indians still believe it is very important to stop intercaste marriages.
Right. The social boundaries, especially around the intimate sphere of marriage, are still heavily policed by communities. Yet, running entirely parallel to that is the undeniable force of economic liberalization. When India opened its economy in the 1990s and non-agricultural jobs exploded, the quality of life for the poorest segments improved dramatically.
The shift in capital is staggering. The proportion of Dalits running their own businesses jumped from roughly 6% to 37% following liberalization.
That's a huge leap.
Yeah. When the free market expanded and global capital flowed in, it provided new avenues for wealth creation that simply bypassed the traditional village-level hierarchies.
It suggests that rapid urbanization and modern commerce are incredibly effective forces in eroding rigid boundaries.
Because you just can't enforce them anymore.
Exactly. When people migrate to massive anonymous cities and work in crowded corporate offices or eat in bustling food courts, the old rural rules of who can share a water source or who can perform a specific job become logistically impossible to enforce.
Let's zoom out and summarize this incredible journey. We started with the assumption that caste was just a perfectly preserved relic from ancient texts. But we discovered that while the broad theory of Varna existed in antiquity, it was more of an elite aspiration. The biological hardening, the strict endogamy locked in during the political expansion of the Gupta Empire.
Right.
Yet, throughout the medieval period, the system remained surprisingly fluid, with social status often earned on the battlefield or the frontier.
Which is such a crucial point.
Yeah. It wasn't until the British colonial administration arrived, measuring skulls and weaponizing census data, that this fluid ecosystem was forced into a rigid, inescapable org chart.
Exactly.
And today, modern democracies are left to untangle the mess, balancing massive affirmative action programs with the realities of a globalized digital economy. This isn't just a history lesson. It is a masterclass in how administrative labels and government categorization can permanently rewrite a society's DNA.
And, this raises an important question, and it's something for you to deeply consider about the trajectory of our own society. Well, we have just seen how a 19th century colonial census, a bureaucratic tool designed merely to classify and manage populations, ended up fundamentally reshaping the identities, the rights, and the destinies of millions of people for generations.
Right.
The administrative tool created the reality.
The map permanently altered the territory.
Precisely. So look at the infrastructure of our world today. We rely increasingly on algorithmic sorting, massive data harvesting, and incredibly rigid online categorizations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. These hidden automated systems are constantly evaluating us to grant or deny us credit loans, job interviews, housing applications, and social mobility.
That's a terrifying thought.
If a rudimentary paper census could freeze a fluid, dynamic society into a rigid hierarchy 150 years ago, what are the implications of today's big data? Are we currently, accidentally, coding a brand new invisible caste system for the future, trapped in a digital census we can't even see?
We've traded the colonial bureaucrat's clipboard for the algorithmic black box.
We have.
It turns out that analytical machine we use to measure society isn't just passively taking a picture. The very act of processing that data might be building invisible walls around us in entirely new ways.
Something to keep in mind.
Definitely. Something to think about the next time an algorithm decides what opportunities you get to see. Thanks for diving deep with us today.